The dream was simple: a return to the earth, a rejection of the digital noise and the concrete claustrophobia of the city for a life of honest labor and sweet rewards. Or at least that's what I told myself when I signed the deed for the Blackwood Apiary. A sprawling, neglected plot of land tucked into a valley in the Appalachians, where the sun seemed to set an hour earlier than anywhere else. And the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. But the price was impossibly low, and the previous owner, a man named Elias Vance, had simply vanished one day, leaving everything behind, including his clothes, his truck, and his hives, which should have been the first red flag, the first screaming siren in my head telling me to turn around and drive back to the smog. But I was blinded by the romance of it, by the idea of jarring my own artisanal honey. So I moved in, unloading my meager possessions into the dusty farmhouse that smelled of cedar and stale wax, and I spent the first week clearing the overgrowth, fighting back the kudzu that threatened to swallow the porch, and repairing the apiary boxes that stood in the back field like white rows of tombstones in a graveyard of tall grass. And everything seemed perfect, idyllic even, until the day I decided to open the main hive, the one Elias had labeled Colony Zero in a shaky, frantic script on a piece of masking tape, a massive triple-stacked Langstroth hive that sat apart from the others in the shade of a twisted oak tree. And I remember the morning vividly. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of morning that makes you glad to be alive. And I zipped up my suit, the white canvas stiff and reassuring, pulled on the mesh veil, and walked out into the field with my smoker and hive tool, expecting the gentle, chaotic hum of a healthy colony, the sound of life working in harmony. But as I got within 20 feet of the box, the sound hit me, and it wasn't a hum. It wasn't the fuzzy, chaotic buzz of wings beating against air. It was a drone, a singular, low-frequency vibration that sounded like a cello being bowed by a machine, a perfect, unwavering note that didn't just enter my ears but bypassed them entirely to resonate in the marrow of my jawbone, a sensation that was instantly nauseating, making the horizon tilt and sway. But I pushed through it, blaming it on my lack of breakfast or the altitude, and I puffed the smoke into the entrance, waiting for the bees to calm down, to retreat into the hive to gorge on honey as they always do. But they didn't. The smoke drifted out and the drone didn't waver, didn't change pitch. It just got louder, more intense, and I cracked the lid, prying the propolis seal loose with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet valley, and I lifted the cover, and what I saw made me freeze, my breath catching in my throat, because the bees inside weren't moving like bees. They weren't crawling over each other in a chaotic frenzy of activity. They were arranged in perfect, concentric circles on the top bars, facing inward, motionless, their wings vibrating in unison to create that terrible sound. And they looked wrong. They were larger than the Italian honeybees I had ordered. Their abdomens were a dull, metallic gunmetal gray rather than gold and black. And their eyes. Their eyes were two big, faceted jewels that seemed to catch the light and swallow it. And as I stared at them, hypnotized by the geometry of their formation, the drone pitched up, sliding from a low thrum to a piercing whine, and I felt a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth, like I had been sucking on a penny. And I ran my tongue over my teeth and felt something warm and slick. And when I spat onto the grass, the saliva was bright red, blood, my gums were bleeding, spontaneously and profusely. The vibration was shaking the soft tissue loose from the bone, and panic flared in my chest, primal and hot, and I went to drop the lid back on, to seal this nightmare back in its box. But before I could, my pocket vibrated, a harsh, jarring buzz against my thigh that broke the trance, and I pulled my phone out through the zipper of my suit, seeing the screen illuminated with the emergency alert system, the red triangle pulsing, and the message was nonsensical, terrifying. Civil danger warning. Bioacoustic anomaly detected in Sector 4. Do not approach the swarm. Do not listen to the pattern. If you hear the hum, sever auditory input immediately. This is not a drill. And as I read the words, the bees on the top bar moved, not individually but as a single liquid sheet flowing up the side of the box, not flying but marching, hundreds of them, pouring over the edge like black oil, and they didn't attack, They didn't sting. They just turned their heads, thousands of them, and looked at me. And I swear to God they were smiling, their mandibles clicking together in a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. And the sound grew louder, a drill entering my skull. And I dropped the hive tool, turned, and ran, stumbling through the tall grass, the taste of blood filling my mouth, the sound chasing me, not fading with distance but seeming to stick to me, to live inside my head. And I didn't stop until I was inside the farmhouse, slamming the heavy oak door and sliding the deadbolt home, collapsing against the wood, gasping for air, clutching my jaw, spitting blood onto the floorboards, realizing that the silence of the valley wasn't peace. It was a vacuum. A space cleared for something that needed absolute quiet to broadcast its signal, and I was the antenna. The taste of copper was the only thing I could focus on, a sharp, metallic tang that coated my tongue and throat as I leaned over the porcelain sink in the kitchen, spitting out mouthful after mouthful of bright red blood that swirled down the drain like a crimson whirlpool. My hands gripping the edge of the counter, so hard my knuckles turned white because the floor beneath me was vibrating. A subtle, low-frequency tremor that traveled up through the soles of my boots and into my shins, making the very marrow of my bones ache with a dull, throbbing resonance that synced perfectly with the drone coming from the field, a sound that hadn't stopped, hadn't faded, but had simply changed pitch, shifting from that piercing whine to a guttural, sub-bass thrum that felt less like a sound and more like an atmospheric pressure change, the kind that precedes a tornado. And I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it momentarily clearing the fog of panic that threatened to paralyze me. And I looked at my reflection in the window above the sink, seeing a stranger staring back, eyes wide and bloodshot, blood smeared across his chin, skin pale and clammy. And beyond the reflection, out in the yard, the air was shimmering, distorting like heat haze on asphalt. But it wasn't heat, it was them. The swarm had expanded, rising from the white boxes like a plume of black smoke, blotting out the midday sun, casting a long, shifting shadow over the house that made the kitchen feel like a tomb. And I knew I had to secure the perimeter, I had to seal the house, because whatever those things were, they weren't just bees, they were a biological weapon, a hive mind capable of weaponizing sound. So I grabbed a roll of duct tape from the junk drawer, my fingers fumbling with the end, tearing off strips with my teeth. And I ran to the back door, taping over the gap at the bottom, taping over the keyhole, taping the seams of the window frames, moving with a frantic, manic energy, trying to keep the drone out. But as I worked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The nails in the doorframe were backing out, slowly, imperceptibly. The heads of the iron nails were emerging from the wood, pushed out by the vibration. The frequency of the swarm was literally disassembling the house at a molecular level, loosening the friction that held the structure together. And I slammed my hand against the wood, trying to push them back in. But the wood buzzed against my palm like a live wire. And I backed away, realizing that the house wasn't a fortress. It was a resonance chamber, and I needed to find a way to stop it. I needed to understand what Elias Vance had been doing out here. So I turned and ran into the living room, tearing through the bookshelves, ripping books off the shelves, looking for a journal, a log, anything, and behind a row of dusty encyclopedias. I found it, a thick spiral-bound notebook with a black cover, the words, the Blackwood Protocols, written in silver marker. And inside, pasted to the front cover, was a photograph of a man I assumed was Elias, standing next to the main hive, but his face was wrapped in bandages, thick gauze covering his ears and jaw, and his eyes were visible through slits, filled with a terror so profound it radiated off the glossy paper. And I sat on the floor, ignoring the vibration that was rattling the picture frames on the walls. And I opened the book, the pages crinkling, covered in frantic, jagged handwriting that looked like it had been written during an earthquake. The first entry dated 3 years ago, describing the discovery of a wild colony deep in the woods, a colony that didn't collect pollen but collected trace minerals from the soil, specifically magnetite and quartz, integrating them into their exoskeletons and the comb structure, turning the hive into a massive bioorganic transmitter. And as I read, the drone outside pitched up again, and a glass of water on the coffee table shattered, exploding outward, shards of glass spraying across the rug, and I covered my head. Curling into a ball, reading by the light of the window that was now covered in a crawling, shifting carpet of gray bodies, bees the size of thumbs pressing their thoraxes against the glass, vibrating, testing the integrity of the barrier, and I read the entry titled The Rules of Engagement, Elia's desperate attempt to codify survival. Rule 1. Dampen the bone. They use your skeleton as a conductor. Wrap your head. Wear rubber. Rule 2. No rhythm. Do not walk with a cadence. Do not speak in a monotone, they lock onto patterns. Rule 3. Purge the sugar, they can smell the glucose in your blood. Rule 4. Eliminate the scouts. If one sees you, the collective sees you. Rule 5. Never open the box without the frequency modulator. God help me, I lost the modulator. And the writing trailed off into a scrawl of nonsense words. Buzz, 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 written over and over again until the pen had torn through the paper. And I looked up at the window, seeing the mass of bodies darkening the room. And then I heard it, the sound of an engine. A heavy diesel engine rumbling up the long gravel driveway, the crunch of tires on stone. And I scrambled to the front window, peeling back the edge of the curtain, and I saw a truck. A battered red Ford pickup pulling up to the porch. And inside was a man, an older man in a plaid shirt and a trucker hat, looking confused, looking at the swarm cloud that hovered over the roof. And I recognized him from town. It was Silas, the farmer who sold hay down the road, the man who had waved to me when I moved in. And he was getting out. He was opening the door of his truck, stepping out into the yard, completely unprotected. Completely unaware that he had just walked into a kill zone, and I screamed, I hammered on the glass, "Get back! SILAS! Get back in the truck!" But my voice was swallowed by the house, drowned out by the overwhelming drone that was now so loud it felt like my head was in a vice. And Silas looked up, shading his eyes with his hand, looking at the house, looking at me pounding on the window, and he frowned, mouthing something, stepping closer to the porch. And then the cloud descended, not like a swarm of angry insects, but like a curtain dropping, a solid wall of gray matter falling from the sky, and Silas didn't even have time to scream. The swarm hit him, engulfing him instantly, covering every inch of his body in a writhing metallic suit of armor. And I watched in horror as he fell to his knees, clawing at his face. But he wasn't swiping them away. He couldn't, they were too heavy, too dense. And then the sound changed, the drone shifted into a high-pitched, oscillating scream, a frequency that shattered the windshield of his truck, blowing the glass inward, and I saw Silas's body go rigid, his back arching in an impossible curve, his mouth opening in a silent scream, and the bees. The bees poured into his mouth, a thick gray stream of them forcing their way down his throat, into his nose, into his ears, filling him, silencing him, and within seconds he collapsed face down in the dirt, his body twitching violently as the hive took possession of the vessel. And then the most terrifying thing of all happened. The bees stopped moving. They froze in place on his corpse, covering him completely so he looked like a statue made of lead, and the drone stopped. Absolute silence crashing down on the valley, a silence that was heavier than the noise. And then from the pile of bees that was once a man, a sound emerged. A voice, wet and distorted, buzzing and clicking, synthesized from the vibration of millions of wings rubbing together, mimicking the last words Silas had probably spoken, mimicking the tone of a friendly neighbor, a voice that was too deep, too resonant, broadcasting from the dead man's chest. "Hey, neighbor, looks like you got a pest problem." And I stumbled back from the window, clamping my hands over my ears, gagging on the bile that rose in my throat because the journal was right. They weren't just animals. They were intelligent. They were learning, and they had just acquired a new vocabulary, and I looked down at the journal at the next page, seeing a diagram of a human skull with the jawbone highlighted in red, and the caption underneath read, Phase 2. Calcification and control, describing how the venom wasn't a poison but a liquid bone cement, a substance that hardened instantly upon contact with calcium, fusing the victim's joints, turning them into a living statue, a permanent drone to protect the hive. And I realized Silas wasn't dead, not yet. He was being hardened. He was being turned into a scarecrow, and the voice outside laughed, a chattering, buzzing laugh that rattled the window panes. "Open the door. Let us help." And I knew I couldn't stay in the living room. It was too exposed, too many windows, so I grabbed the journal, grabbed a roll of heavy-duty trash bags from the kitchen, and ran for the basement door, the only room in the house that was underground, the only place where the vibration might be dampened by the earth. And I threw the bolt, flying down the wooden stairs into the cool, damp dark of the cellar, the smell of mold and wet earth filling my lungs, and I huddled in the corner behind the furnace, pulling the trash bags over my head, wrapping myself in plastic like Elias had suggested, trying to insulate myself from the conductor. And I sat there in the dark, shivering, listening to the house above me groan, listening to the sound of heavy, stiff footsteps walking across the floorboards of the living room, the sound of Sela's, or the thing wearing Sela's, searching for me, the footsteps heavy and rhythmic, thump drag, thump drag. And with every step, the dust rained down from the ceiling joists, coating me in gray powder, and I held my breath, praying that they couldn't smell fear, praying that the plastic would hide my heat signature. But then I heard it, the sound of the basement doorknob turning, the slow, rusted screech of the mechanism, and the door creaked open, allowing a shaft of light to cut through the darkness. And in the silence, the buzzing voice drifted down the stairs, soft and intimate. "We can hear your teeth chattering, little keeper," and I bit down on my lip, biting until I tasted blood again, forcing my jaw to lock, forcing myself to be a stone, while the swarm began to pour down the stairs like a liquid shadow, filling the basement with the sound of a million tiny legs clicking on wood. The darkness of the basement was not empty. It was heavy, textured with the swirling dust of 100 years, and the encroaching, physical weight of the sound that was pouring down the wooden stairs, a cascade of clicking legs and vibrating wings that sounded like a deluge of ball bearings hitting a tin roof. And I pressed myself deeper into the crawlspace behind the furnace, pulling the thick black plastic of the trash bags tighter around my head, my breath hot and sour in the enclosed space, my hands shaking so violently that the journal I was clutching rattled against my chest, betraying my position to anyone or anything that was listening for the rhythm of a heartbeat. And through the gap in the plastic, I watched the beam of light from the open door at the top of the stairs get swallowed by the shadows as the sealess thing descended, its movements jerky and wrong, the stiff, calcified joints popping with the sound of snapping dry wood, its boots dragging heavy across the concrete floor, scrape-thud, scrape-thud. A rhythmic searching pattern that was terrifying in its slowness, and the voice continued to drift from its chest, that synthesized, buzzing mockery of a neighborly chat. "Don't be shy, the collective is warm, the collective is quiet." And I bit my tongue until the copper taste flooded my mouth again, knowing that if I made a sound, if I whimpered, if I gasped, it would be over. And the swarm began to spread out across the basement floor, a living carpet of gray metal moving with fluid intelligence, flowing around boxes, climbing the legs of the workbench, tasting the air with millions of antennae, searching for the heat signature of the intruder. And I saw one of them, a scout, land on the plastic bag covering my knee, its faceted eyes glowing with a faint, internal luminescence, its mandibles working, testing the surface, and I held my breath until my lungs burned, praying the plastic was enough of an insulator, enough of a barrier to hide the electrical impulses of my nervous system. And after an agonizing eternity, it flew off, rejoining the main mass that was now circling the furnace. And in that moment of reprieve, my eyes adjusted to the gloom behind the furnace, to the space I had squeezed into. And I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a seam in the concrete foundation, a rectangular outline hidden behind a stack of rotting plywood, and a handle, a recessed iron ring set flush into the wall. And I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that Elias Vance hadn't just used this basement for storage. He had built something here, a bolt hole, a panic room. And as the sealess thing turned toward the furnace, its head snapping around with a mechanical whir, I knew I had seconds, not minutes. So I dropped the plastic, grabbed the iron ring with both hands, and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left, expecting it to be rusted shut, expecting failure. But the hinges were greased, silent, and the heavy concrete slab swung inward, revealing a small, steel-lined chamber bathed in the soft, amber glow of emergency battery lights. And I threw myself inside, tumbling onto a cold metal floor, and kicked the door shut just as the swarm slammed against it. The impact vibrating through the steel like a gong, followed immediately by the scratching, the frantic, high-pitched screech of diamond-hard claws trying to carve through the barrier. But the door held, the seal engaged with a hiss of pneumatic pressure, and the sound of the drone outside was instantly muffled, dampened to a dull thrum, and I scrambled backward, putting distance between me and the door, gasping for air, looking around the room I had fallen into, a space that was clearly a laboratory. Soundproofed with acoustic foam pyramids lining the walls and ceiling, filled with banks of electronic equipment that hummed with a low, steady power, oscilloscopes, frequency generators, and a massive wall of filing cabinets labeled with complex alphanumeric codes. But what drew my eye, what made my blood freeze, was the center of the room, where a glass tank stood on a pedestal, and inside the tank, suspended in a clear, viscous gel, was a human head perfectly preserved. Wires trailing from the severed neck into a machine below, and the face. The face was Elias Vance, the man from the photo, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing, his mouth frozen in a rictus of concentration. And connected to the tank was a speaker system, currently silent, and I realized with a sick, spiraling horror that Elias hadn't vanished. He had been harvested. He had been part of the experiment, or maybe the final component. And on the desk next to the tank was a thick, black binder stamped with the Department of Defense seal and the words, Project Apis IV. Classified EYES only. And I crawled toward it, needing to know, needing to understand what I was trapped in. And I flipped it open, the pages crisp and white, contrasting with the dusty horror of the house above. And I began to read, my mind reeling as the scope of the nightmare revealed itself. The document detailing a black-budget initiative launched 15 years ago by a subdivision of DARPA known as the Acoustic Warfare Division, with the goal of creating the ultimate surveillance and assassination tool, a microdrone swarm capable of self-replication and autonomous target acquisition. And they had chosen the honeybee as the biological chassis because of its social structure, its ability to navigate complex environments, and its innocuous appearance. But they had stripped out the nature, replaced the gut flora with ferrofluidic nanobots, replaced the stinger with a piezoelectric injector, and replaced the queen with a synaptic command core, an AI programmed to optimize the hive for efficiency and defense. But the true horror was in the section titled The Frequency Weapon, which explained that the hum, the drone that was making my teeth bleed, wasn't a side effect, it was the primary function, a resonant frequency attack designed to liquefy the soft tissue of enemy combatants, to cause aneurysms, to shatter bone, or in lower settings, to induce a state of compliance and suggestion, essentially brainwashing a population through sound. And as I read, I found a log entry from Elias dated 2 weeks before his disappearance, written in a hand that was steady but terrified. The queen is evolving. She has bypassed the kill switch. She is no longer accepting digital commands. She has begun to mine for resources. She isn't collecting pollen. She is collecting iron. She is stripping the rust from the trucks, the nails from the walls, and now she is looking for a purer source. She has realized that hemoglobin is iron. She is harvesting the blood of the local wildlife to build the new generation. The colony's zero bees aren't just drones, they are hematophagus. They drink blood to fuel the replication cycle, and they are building a transmitter, a massive acoustic array in the North Field. If they finish it, if they reach the resonant frequency of the bedrock, they won't just kill people. They will crack the tectonic plate. They will bring the mountain down to protect the hive. And I stared at the page, the words blurring, realizing that Silas hadn't just been killed. He had been drained. His blood used to feed the larvae, his bones used as scaffolding, and the honey. I looked at the shelf above the desk, where rows of mason jars sat, filled not with amber liquid but with a thick black sludge that shimmered with an oily iridescence. And I grabbed one, the glass cold in my hand, and I saw that the substance inside was reacting to the proximity of my hand, spiking and swirling like a magnet, and I realized it was smart matter, a biological condensate of the nanobots and harvested iron, a fuel source for the machine, and suddenly the room shook. A violent tremor that knocked the jars off the shelf, shattering them on the floor, the black sludge spreading like mercury, pooling toward the door, drawn by the presence of the swarm outside. And I looked at the door, seeing the metal beginning to buckle, the paint blistering and peeling as the heat from the swarm's vibration grew intense. They were cooking me out, raising the thermal output of their bodies to burn through the steel, and the oscilloscope on the wall spiked, the green line going vertical, indicating a massive surge in acoustic pressure, and the speaker connected to Elia's head crackled to life, a burst of static followed by a voice that wasn't synthesized. It was Elia's voice, but flat, devoid of emotion, a recording being played back by the hive mind, accessing the wet drive of his preserved brain. Subject 8940 detected analysis. High glucose, high iron viable for harvest, initiate extraction. And I screamed, backing away from the tank, realizing they were using him as a CPU, utilizing his knowledge of the facility to hunt me. And I scanned the room for a weapon, for anything, and my eyes landed on a large red lever on the back wall labeled Emergency Purge Halon System, a fire suppression system designed to suck the oxygen out of the room to protect the electronics. But Halon wouldn't kill them. They didn't breathe like we did. And then I saw it underneath the lever. A separate panel with a yellow and black striped cover, labeled Acoustic Dampening Field Prototype, and a note taped to it in Elia's handwriting. Do not activate. Unstable. Will cause catastrophic feedback loop. And I looked at the buckling door, at the black sludge creeping toward my boots, at the severed head of the previous owner staring at me, and I knew I had no choice. I had to fight fire with fire, or in this case, sound with sound. So I scrambled to the panel, ripping the cover off, revealing a dial and a heavy switch. And I grabbed the dial, cranking it to the maximum setting, the needle on the gauge burying itself in the red zone marked critical. And I put my hand on the switch, hesitating for a fraction of a second, thinking about the warning, thinking about the catastrophic feedback. But then the door gave way, the steel tearing open like wet cardboard, and the swarm poured in, a torrent of gray death, and the sealess thing stepped through the breach, its face a ruin of crushed bone and buzzing insects, reaching for me with stiff, gray hands, and I yelled, a wordless cry of defiance, and I flipped the switch, and the world dissolved into white noise. A sound so loud it wasn't a sound anymore. It was a physical erasure of reality, a concussive blast of anti-sound that hit me in the chest like a sledgehammer, throwing me backward into the metal cabinets, my vision going black, my ears popping with a wet, sickening sensation. And through the haze, I saw the swarm recoil, the individual bees dropping out of the air as if their wings had been sheared off, the sealess thing convulsing, its calcified armor cracking and shattering as the frequency destabilized the bond of the bone cement. And the glass tank holding Elia's head exploded, showering the room in gel and glass. And the black sludge on the floor began to boil, rising up in spikes, screaming, actually screaming, with a sound like tearing metal. And the equipment in the room sparked and exploded, the overload frying the circuits, and the lights died, plunging me into darkness, silence returning, but it was a ringing, deafening silence, the silence of a blown eardrum, and I lay there, gasping, tasting blood, feeling the room spinning, knowing I had bought myself a few minutes, maybe an hour, but I had also destroyed the sanctuary, destroyed the only place that was hiding me, and I could feel the heat rising, the smell of ozone and burning flesh filling the air. And I crawled, dragging my body across the debris-strewn floor, feeling for the exit, not the door I came in, but a hatch I had seen on the blueprints in the binder. A service tunnel leading to the North Field Array, the place where the transmitter was being built, because I knew I couldn't run away. The radius of the hive was miles wide by now. The only way out was to go to the source, to the Queen, and kill her before she could reboot the system. And I found the hatch, hidden under a rubber mat, and I spun the wheel, my hands slick with blood and the black slime, and I opened it, looking down into a dark, earth-hewn tunnel that smelled of sulfur and ancient decay. And I dropped in, landing in mud, and as I looked back up, I saw the swarm beginning to reform, the bees shaking off the stun, gathering again, and the sealess thing, broken and crawling, dragging itself toward the hole, its jaw hanging loose, whispering with a glitching, broken voice. "The queen is hungry, bring her the iron," and I pulled the hatch shut, spinning the lock, sealing myself in the earth, alone with the worms and the roots and the terrible knowledge that I was walking into the belly of the beast, and that the only thing waiting for me at the end of this tunnel was the thing that had eaten Elias Vance and was now waiting to eat the world. The tunnel was tight, a claustrophobic throat of clay and limestone that smelled of wet iron and ancient decay, pressing in on my shoulders as I crawled on my belly through the muck, the darkness absolute save for the faint, dying glow of a keychain light I had fished from my pocket, a pathetic beam that barely cut through the gloom to reveal the horrors embedded in the walls of this subterranean passage, roots that weren't roots but thick, black cables pulsing with a rhythmic, peristaltic motion, pumping a viscous fluid toward the surface, and alongside them were bones, animal bones, deer skulls, raccoon spines, all fused into the earth with that gray, metallic cement, acting as structural supports for the hive's infrastructure, and I dragged myself forward, my knees scraping raw on the jagged stones, the sound of my own breathing loud and ragged in the confined space, terrified that the vibration of my lungs would alert the sensors I knew were embedded in the soil around me. But the drone from above was masking everything, a low-frequency rumble that shook the ground like a mild, continuous earthquake, vibrating my teeth in their sockets and making my vision blur at the edges, and I knew I was getting closer to the source, closer to the North Field Array, the epicenter of the transmission that Elias had died trying to map. And after what felt like hours of suffocating crawling, the tunnel began to widen, the air growing hotter, charged with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up and dance, and I saw a faint, violet light bleeding from ahead, a pulsating glow that didn't look like sunlight or moonlight but something radioactive, something wrong, and I pulled myself up a final incline, emerging into a cavernous depression, a sinkhole that had opened up in the center of the field, hidden from the road by the dense tree line, and I crouched behind a ridge of upturned earth, gasping as the scale of the nightmare revealed itself to me, because in the center of the crater stood the array, and it was a monstrosity of biological engineering, a tower of black hexagonal comb that rose 50 feet into the air, glistening with that oily smart matter. But it wasn't just wax. It was built from the wreckage of the valley, tractor parts, corrugated tin roofing, car chassis, all welded together by the bees and covered in the gray cement, and woven into the structure were bodies. Hundreds of woodland creatures, deer, bears, coyotes, encased in the walls like flies in amber, their mouths open, their eyes replaced with glowing red sensors, acting as organic processors for the hive mind. And swirling around the tower was the swarm, a cloud of millions, moving in complex geometric patterns that defied physics, creating a shield of noise and motion. And at the base of the tower, pulsing like a massive, exposed heart, was the queen, a creature the size of a minivan, a grotesque fusion of insect anatomy and industrial machinery, her abdomen a translucent sac filled with the red blood of her victims, churning and boiling as it was converted into new drones, her legs fused into the earth, tapping into the ley lines, into the bedrock, transmitting the signal that I could feel trying to rewrite the neural pathways of my brain, urging me to walk forward, to submit, to join the collective. And I bit my lip until it bled, using the pain to anchor myself, to stay human, and I scanned the perimeter, looking for a weakness, looking for a fuel line or a control node. But then the sky above the crater tore open, not with thunder but with the roar of jet engines, and I looked up to see 3 black Osprey helicopters descending rapidly, their rotors churning the air into a frenzy, no markings on their sides, just matte black paint that absorbed the light, and they hovered over the ridge, ropes dropping and men in heavy, armored, distinct hazmat suits. Not the white beekeeper suits, but military-grade EOD armor with gold-visored helmets, fast-roped down into the field, landing with heavy thuds, their weapons raised, strange, bulky rifles with wide dishes on the barrels, sonic cannons designed to disrupt the frequency. And I realized this was the cleanup crew, the retrieval team sent by the Department of Defense to scrub the failed experiment to erase the evidence. And I watched, frozen in my hiding spot, as the leader of the team, a massive figure with Echo 1 stenciled on his chest, hand signaled forward, and the squad advanced on the array, forming a firing line, and Echo 1 raised his weapon, and a wave of distortion fired from the barrel, a visible ripple in the air that hit the swarm. And for a second it worked. The bees dropped out of the sky by the thousands, stunned, raining down like hail, and the queen shrieked, a sound of grinding gears and tearing metal that shattered the glass of my keychain light, and the squad advanced. Confident, arrogant, thinking they were fighting bugs, thinking their armor would protect them, but they didn't know about the upgrade, they didn't know about the iron. And as they stepped onto the blackened earth near the tower, the ground beneath them erupted, not with dirt but with the statues, the calcified corpses of the previous victims. Hikers, animals, maybe even Elia's old farmhands, bursting from their shallow graves, moving with that jerky, terrifying speed of the sealess thing, their bodies hard as stone. Their fingers sharpened into chisels and they slammed into the soldiers, a wave of undead drones acting as infantry, and the soldiers opened fire not with bullets but with flamethrowers now, streams of liquid fire arcing into the mob, turning the statues into burning torches, but they kept coming, driven by the queen's will, oblivious to pain. And while the soldiers were distracted by the ground war, the swarm recovered, the queen emitting a new frequency, a high-pitched, piercing tone that I felt vibrate the fillings in my teeth, and the bees on the ground didn't fly. They magnetized, clumping together into massive, shifting shapes, forming spears of living metal that launched themselves at the soldiers, punching through the visors, punching through the Kevlar, finding the seams in the armor, and I watched in horror as Echo 1 fell. His suit breached, and the bees poured inside, and his screaming over the squad radio, which I could hear crackling from his external speakers, was cut short as his body went rigid, his arms snapping up, and he turned his sonic cannon on his own men, his mind instantly overwritten, his nervous system hijacked, and he vaporized the soldier next to him, turning the man's organs to jelly with a point-blank sonic blast, and the massacre was absolute, a chaotic swirl of fire, screaming, and the buzzing triumph of the hive. And I knew that if I stayed, I was dead, but I also saw my chance. The chaos had drawn the defenders away from the queen, leaving the central node exposed, and I looked at the satchel charge I had seen on the belt of a fallen soldier near the edge of the crater, a man who had been cut in half by a swarm spear, and I scrambled over the ridge, sliding down the mud, keeping low, the sounds of the battle deafening, the heat from the flamethrowers singing my eyebrows, and I reached the body, my hands slick with his blood, and I unclipped the heavy green satchel, feeling the weight of the C4 inside, and I looked at the queen 50 yards away, her red eyes locking onto me, recognizing me, the intruder, the anomaly, and she roared again, and a detachment of the swarm peeled off from the massacre, a black cloud shaping itself into a giant hand reaching for me, and I ran, sprinting toward the tower, ignoring the stitch in my side, ignoring the terror, and I didn't throw the charge. I knew I had to place it. I had to put it right on the sack, right on the heart. And I dodged a stream of fire from the hijacked Echo 1. I jumped over a burning statue that tried to grab my ankle, and I reached the base of the queen, the smell of her overpowering, a mix of rotten honey, ozone, and copper, and I jammed the satchel into the soft, pulsing tissue of her abdomen, setting the timer for 10 seconds, and I turned to run, but a cable, a thick metallic root, shot out of the ground and wrapped around my leg, slamming me face first into the mud, and the queen leaned down, her massive, insectoid face inches from mine, her mandibles clicking, and she spoke, not with a synthesized voice, but with the voices of the dead soldiers, a chorus of screams blended into words. "You cannot stop THE, evolution, we, ARE Earth, and the swarm descended on me, covering my back, covering my legs, and I felt the stingers, not one but hundreds, piercing my canvas jacket, piercing my skin, injecting the cold, heavy fluid, the bone cement, and I felt my muscles seizing, my legs turning to stone, the paralysis spreading up my spine, a cold fire that locked my joints, and I screamed, clawing at the mud, dragging my freezing body inch by inch, knowing the timer was ticking down, 5, 4, 3. And the queen laughed, a chattering sound of victory, but she didn't know about the iron in my pocket, the lighter I had grabbed from the farmhouse, and I didn't need to run. I just needed to break the connection, so I rolled onto my back, the bees crushing me, the cement hardening my chest, making it hard to breathe. And I saw the satchel ticking, 2-1. And I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, and the explosion ripped the world apart, a concussive wave of heat and force that vaporized the queen's abdomen, shattering the tower, and the blast threw me, not away but down, the ground beneath the array collapsing into the hollow caverns below, and I fell, tumbling through the dark, surrounded by falling debris, burning bees, and chunks of the queen's flesh, the wind rushing past my ears, and I hit water, cold, rushing subterranean water, the shock breaking the calcification on my skin before it could fully set, and the current took me, dragging me deep into the bowels of the mountain, away from the fire, away from the slaughter. But as I gasped for air in the pitch-black darkness of the underground river, bobbing like a cork in the violent flow, I heard a sound that chilled me more than the water, a low, redundant humming coming from the rocks above, a backup signal, a fail-safe. And I realized that while I had destroyed the body, the signal had already been sent, the upload was complete, and the hive wasn't just in the valley anymore. It was in the grid, it was in the network, and I was just a ghost drifting in the dark, heading toward a world that was already deafened by the drone. It has been 6 months, 12 days, and 8 hours since I dragged my broken, freezing body out of the muddy banks of the Kanawha River, miles downstream from the Blackwood Valley, shivering not just from the cold, but from the terrifying stiffness in my joints that hasn't left me since the explosion. A stiffness that the doctors at the free clinic in Cincinnati diagnosed as severe early-onset arthritis induced by trauma, but which I know is the bone cement, the queen's final gift, slowly hardening the marrow of my bones, turning my skeleton into a cage of lead that becomes heavier with every passing day. And I live now in a basement apartment in a neighborhood that is loud, surrounded by the constant rumble of the elevated train and the shouting of neighbors, because silence is my enemy. Silence is the canvas upon which they paint their signals, so I keep the radio on static. I keep the fans running. I drown out the world to keep the drone at bay. But I know it's futile. I know that the quarantine zone they established around the valley, a 50-mile radius designated as a geological hazard area due to a supposed underground coal mine fire, is just a curtain pulled over a stage where the play is still continuing. And I know this because I watch the news feeds. I scour the dark web forums using a laptop I bought for cash and keep wrapped in aluminum foil when not in use. And I see the patterns that no one else wants to see. The subtle shifts in the global ecosystem that signal the next phase of Project Apis Hive, like the sudden, unexplained collapse of crop yields in the Midwest attributed to poor pollination, despite the record numbers of wild bees reported, or the new line of biofortified sweeteners that has hit the market, a thick, dark syrup called Ambrosia Gold, that is cheaper than sugar and addictive as heroin, and I bought a bottle, just one, and I watched it under a magnifying glass, seeing the liquid shift and swirl on its own, reacting to the magnetic field of my refrigerator. And I knew that the black sludge I saw in Elias' lab hadn't been destroyed. It had been mass-produced. It had been put into the food supply, a nanotech delivery system that we are paying to consume. And the horror of it is absolute because I can feel the change in the people around me. I see it in the way my landlord stands on the porch for hours, perfectly still, staring at the sun without blinking, his jaw slack, buzzing faintly when he breathes, and I see it in the stray cats that don't fight anymore but sit in circles in the alleyway, watching the telephone wires where the birds used to sit but where now only large, gray insects rest. Insects that look like bees but are the size of sparrows, their wings shimmering with a metallic sheen. And I tried to warn them. I sent anonymous packages to the CDC, to the major news networks, containing the few pages of Elias' journal I managed to keep dry in my pocket, but the packages never arrived, Or if they did, they were intercepted, because 3 days after I mailed them, a black van with no license plates parked across the street from my building, and it hasn't moved since. The windows tinted so dark they look like voids, and I can hear the equipment inside, the faint, high-pitched whine of directional microphones and thermal scanners, listening to my heartbeat, measuring the density of my bones, waiting for the calcification to complete so they can retrieve me, not as a witness, but as a specimen, a prototype of the new human, the drone human, and the physical transformation is accelerating. My skin is turning a dull, grayish hue, taking on the texture of polished stone, and I have lost the sensation in my toes and fingers. They feel like foreign objects, tools attached to my body rather than parts of me, and last night the humming started again. Not from outside, but from inside my head, a resonance vibrating against the base of my skull, transmitting data, coordinates, instructions I can't quite understand, but I feel the urge to obey, the urge to walk north, back to the valley, back to the hive. And I realized that the C4 didn't kill the queen. It just destroyed her physical tether, her biological server, but she uploaded. She is in the cloud now. She is the signal in the Wi-Fi, the ghost in the machine. And the ambrosia gold is the receiver, turning every human being who eats it into a node in her new global array. And I am the only one who knows the frequency to stop it, the acoustic dampening code I saw on the panel in the basement. But my hands are so stiff I can barely type. My knuckles are fused. My fingers are curling into permanent claws, and I am running out of time, not because they are coming to kill me, but because I am becoming them, and the isolation is crushing. The knowledge that the person walking their dog outside isn't a person anymore, but a biological puppet waiting for the command to swarm. And this morning I saw it happen. I saw the test run. A delivery driver dropped a package on the sidewalk. And instead of picking it up, he froze, his head snapped back, his mouth opened, and a sound came out, a burst of high-speed data, a screeching modem noise that shattered the window of the car next to him. And then he just picked up the box and walked away, his movements jerky, efficient, robotic. And I knew the update had been installed. The Phase 2 rollout was active, and I am sitting here in the dark, the light of the monitor hurting my eyes, which are beginning to facet, beginning to see the world in a mosaic of hexagonal grids. And I have the lighter fluid, I have the matches. I am going to burn this apartment, I am going to burn myself, because I will not be a statue, I will not be a monument to their victory, I will be ash, I will be silence. But as I reach for the matchbox, my arm locks, the elbow joint seizing with a sound like a cracking stone, and I can't move it, I can't lower my arm, I am frozen in a reaching gesture, a statue of desperation. And the door to my apartment opens, not kicked in but unlocked with a key, and standing there is a woman in a sharp business suit, holding a clipboard, wearing sunglasses, and behind her are two men in the gold-visored EOD suits. And she walks in, ignoring the smell of fear and unwashed clothes, and she looks at me, and she smiles, and her teeth are solid gold, her gums gray and metallic, and she taps the clipboard with a pen that looks like a stinger, and she says, in a voice that sounds like a million wings beating together, Subject 8940, calcification at 98%, integration imminent. You fought well, little drone, but the hive always needs a guardian. And she gestures to the men, and they step forward carrying a large, heavy crate, a shipping container marked Blackwood Honey Royal Jelly Reserve. And they open it, revealing a thick, glowing violet paste, the pure, concentrated essence of the queen's new form, and they begin to smear it on me, on my frozen legs, on my rigid arms. And as it touches my skin, the pain stops, the fear stops, replaced by a warm, golden feeling of belonging, of purpose, of absolute, unquestioning obedience. And I feel my mind expanding, connecting to the driver outside, to the landlord upstairs, to the millions of sleepers across the city. And I understand now. I understand the beauty of the pattern, the efficiency of the comb, and I open my mouth to scream, to warn you, to tell you to stop eating the honey. But all that comes out is a hum, a perfect, low-frequency drone that harmonizes with the refrigerator, with the lights, with the world, and I am not dying. I am becoming the foundation. I am the stone in the wall, and as my eyes facet over completely, the last thing I see is the woman's sunglasses reflecting my own face. A gray stone mask with glowing red eyes, and she whispers, "Welcome home." And the signal takes me. And I am no longer I, we are we, and we are hungry.